today's session is about MCP servers for enterprise, specifically how to harness, secure, and scale them. And this just feels like such a big moment right now. In particular, if you've noticed that things are moving way more quickly in the world, I think AI is having some part of that, and MCP is a really important strategy for deploying that. Today, I've got two goals. One, demonstrate MCP, and number two, demystify it. It's really changing and evolving rapidly, and we keep our pulse on it. And my goal is to kind of be a bit of a Sherpa on what's out there and what's changing. I will say that this technology is likely to transform our industry. And I'm not just saying that because our company is focused on that. Our company is focused on that because I truly believe how impactful this is, especially because our team has had 9, 10 years of experience building integration technology, and MCP solves so many problems related to connectivity and integrations. And so let's dive in. I'm going to start by addressing the sort of background of what's going on. In particular, you probably have seen reports like this, where there are the AI haves and the AI have-nots. This MIT report came out about a month ago and said that 95% of generative AI pilots at companies are failing. And I think that the way that this is phrased is that the pilots are failing maybe misses some of the point that in reality, it's the companies are failing to actually adopt and use AI. At the end of the day, there are people that are getting this to work, and it's kind of this split where you have companies started by 19 or 20-year-olds going from 0 to $20 million in a year using AI, and then you have executives who are effectively trying to blame regulation or model performance. And this MIT report, in a slightly provocative way, came out and said, actually, it's not the models that are failing, it's flawed enterprise integration. That's the problem for AI adoption. And I agree with this. Now, enterprise integration could really mean two things, and I think it means both of them. On one hand, it's how well are you integrating AI into your business processes? In other words, are you using AI for the things that are able to be influenced and benefit from AI? And on the flip side, and where we'll be spending most of our time today, how well have you integrated this AI into your tools? Have you given it access to the context it needs and the tools it needs to actually do its work? Because without integration like that, that would be like hiring an employee and then not giving them a password to a computer. They're effectively just going to sit there with only the context you give them. So let's first talk about that enterprise integration side, how well it fits into the org. In reality, AI and MCP as a sort of subset of that is just as effective as you can make it. If your organization understands your workflows and can easily adapt to change, well, I've got really good news. AI is going to help you get there a lot faster and a lot less expensively than just throwing people at those problems. But if your organization has poor self-awareness and limited adaptability, then AI is just going to speed your path to run in circles and not really get somewhere. And that's why that 95% is such a sort of dramatic split. And so I will say at the very beginning of this presentation, MCP and AI are not going to solve the business organizational problems that are still necessary to solve in order to get the benefit. This really is a people problem first, understanding where AI can help, understanding what processes are running in your business, and being able to map those out. That said, assuming you get that figured out, that's where now it comes to how well can you integrate AI into your existing tools? Because AI needs to understand and it needs to take action. Before MCP, I think most of us experienced ChatGPT a couple years ago, where you had to give it all of the context to be able to do its job. And it was limited. It would hallucinate things. The model wasn't even that great back then, but the models have gotten tremendously more powerful. In the interim, there was this period of time where individuals or teams would be building things for tool calling and structured inputs and structured outputs. But it became really expensive to build these connectors. And so what happened is this concept of MCP evolved. Anthropic being the organization that put this forward first, and then everybody else stepped in line. OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, everybody has embraced MCP as this sort of universal connector. And that basically means instead of having to go into your motherboard and solder in the connections, you have like a USB style, anything that shows up in the mail from Amazon, you can plug it into your computer and it's going to work. And that's the promise of MCP. And so that's why MCP is what we consider to be this integration layer required for enterprise success, going back to that MIT report. So if you get MCP solved correctly, I believe that you'll have a much better chance of going from the 95% not making AI work to the 5%. Hopefully, we can grow that pie that are making AI work. So let's demystify it just a little bit. What is MCP? Well, before MCP, and my team knows this all too well, you'd have to spend a bunch of time reading documentation for things you were going to integrate with, whether that might be Stripe for your payment system or even an internal service that somebody within your organization stood up. And that would take multiple hours or days. And then step two is you'd actually have to build those integrations, connect to the APIs, and that would also take hours or days. And obviously, some AI could make building these integrations easier, but what's better than building the integrations is just having them ready to go. And that's where MCP comes in and provides this promise that you can connect these tools through this universal protocol for communication. I like to think of MCP today as the Wright Flyer of 1907, the Wright brothers' first airplane. It's something that is this breakthrough technology. It's going to transform our world in more ways than I think today we can comprehend. Just like the airplane in 1907 was this crazy concept, and they had no idea exactly how the world was going to evolve. But like the Wright Flyer, this comes with some risks, and operating MCP requires some degree of skill. And so that's the state of MCP today. It's really this early stages. Now, that doesn't mean it should be ignored. In fact, I think it actually just means that it should be embraced carefully and invested in because if you're here and you're early, you're going to get those advantages and that step up against organizations that aren't adopting the future. So without MCP, you used to have to provide all that context, and you could effectively get your AI to do one step, code the solution. With MCP, you can now provide these really rich flows of information and processes and steps. So, for example, you could start with a trigger that says pull a ticket from Jira, use the Atlassian MCP, create a GitHub branch, use the GitHub MCP, read internal documentation, maybe the Notion MCP, and so on. Effectively, MCP allows AI to stitch together these different steps in a process in order to achieve a goal that requires context and actions, just like a human would. And I'm going to show you right now an example of that in play. So earlier this morning, I ran this, where effectively I have this sales call note in Notion in this tab here, which I'll show you in a minute. It's called Mike's Sales Call with TechWave Solutions, and it's in Notion. And I'm going to ask Claude in this case to use all the MCPs that I've connected to go read that note. And so here you can see the note here has some basic call notes and then actually take actions on it. Create some tickets in Linear for the product team and some GitHub issues for the engineering team. And you could see through the run, and this run took about a minute, but this might otherwise have taken a human maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And it's not even like we're talking about timescales here because this can be spun up as you need them. And so it's almost like this elastic ability to hire the AI. Imagine if you could hire humans as you needed them to do the job, and then you don't have to pay them when they're not working anymore. That's exactly what this kind of model sets up for you. And so you could see here at the start, it is running these MCP calls. Now, this is really going down to the details of what MCP is, but you could see this call is running through the Notion server using the search tool. And it's saying, hey, please find the Mike sales call with TechWave Solutions. And, not to go too far into the details, but this is what the MCP server for Notion responded. And you can see each step of the way this is happening. Now, we're running this through our MCP gateway, which I'll explore a little bit more later at the end of the call, how that fits into it. But that ends up producing things like the logs that you'll see here so that you can actually see what's going on. And so at the end of it, I have these two issues that got created. I have these two issues that got created here in Linear. And so what's magical about MCP is it doesn't require you to necessarily change what solutions you're offering. It just works with those existing ones and fits in with how your humans work. So now either human or AI engineers can come take these issues out of GitHub and begin working on them. And so rolling back up the stack here, that is an example of one of those multi-step processes. Now that happened to run through Claude, but it could run through any agent platform that you choose, and you could see how each of those little tool calls along the way, that's how the agent was able to either fetch some type of context it needed, like here, or actually take actions, create issues here. And so it's that input and that output that are running through MCP. So this is not just experimental. There are organizations out there using this to great effect. And one of the organizations that has really, I think, pulled ahead is Block. And Angie Jones, the VP of engineering at Block, has written some great content about this. And they built something internally called Goose, and it uses a bunch of MCP servers for Snowflake and Jira and Slack and GitHub and Google Drive. And because of this, they're citing that some of their employees are saving between 50 to 75% of their time on what they call common tasks. And things that used to take days could be completed now in hours. And so there's really big benefits to be had here if you're able to use it effectively. So I think it's worth it. However, and this is, I think, the main point of the talk here, the protocol just says how MCP communications can work. It effectively describes that sort of, if I go back to this example here, it describes this sort of call and response pattern between the tools in this universal way. If you want to think about, English language, for example, it's like everybody has just agreed to speak a very specific language, maybe a made-up language like Esperanto for those that know what Esperanto is, but it's a single language that everybody agrees to communicate with. But it's still up to you as an enterprise leader in your org to figure out how to make this work. MCP is not batteries included. And so it's funny, when we started solving this problem a couple months ago for organizations, we thought that it would actually be a top-down, start with security, figure out observability, and then go to enablement. And what we found is that in reality, it's more like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs here, where first you just have to get the enablement working. Getting MCP working is still a place where a number of organizations are struggling. And I can explain why and how to overcome that. Then it comes to observability, being able to see what's happening, to measure it, to be able to adapt to it. And then the cherry on top is really the security. Now, it's not to say that you have to throw out security to get this to work, but the point is that for your peers, the way in which everybody's prioritizing this right now, and I think it makes sense, is get it to work, see that it's working, and then make sure that it's secure. Because if it's not going to work, it's not even worth really investing in. And so that's why folks are focused on the bottom here on enablement. So let's talk about protocol versus product. What part does the protocol solve, and what part is left up to products to solve? So the protocol solves things like that unified language, solves things like vendor independence. You don't have to pick a format for integrating with Anthropic's Claude or OpenAI's ChatGPT. MCP is portable. So if you change what model vendor you're using, MCP goes with you. And that's one of the really nice parts about this protocol. And it also has this really beautiful network effect where every MCP server that pops up gets the benefit of now being able to thread work through other MCPs. And that's why MCP is going to work. Even though it has immaturity problems and it's developing, there's just so much support behind it and it benefits so much from these network effects that all of these little issues, these teething issues, as I'd like to call them, are getting worked out right now. However, on the product side, the protocol is not going to solve things like authentication and identity. It'll say how to use authentication and identity, but it's not going to directly connect to your IDP and figure out how you want it to work for specific servers. It's also not going to tell you how to set up your enterprise ops. You still need to figure out how to get audit trails, observability, maintain compliance. The protocol is not going to solve that for you. And then just infrastructure in general. This is a whole new world of setting up these servers and getting them to work and maintaining them. And heck, the protocol doesn't even have a timeout coordination aspect. And so one of the issues plaguing the community right now is you'll connect a server that might need, 70 seconds to do something, maybe run a report, and the client that's sitting there waiting will have a 30 or 60-second timeout and fail. And so the protocol right now, I actually was the one that put forward that proposal currently in consideration for the protocol to be able to actually make that a part of the protocol and solve that problem. But this requires a lot of highly specialized knowledge to actually work, and that's where the product layer comes in. Let's talk about deploying MCPs, something that we have a lot of experience with. There's organizational challenges. These are going to be the challenges that all of you joining in are going to be probably solving. First of all, it's the skill gap in training. Getting your team, whoever's managing MCP, to understand OAuth flows, JSON RPC, and just simply what does it mean to have an AI first design pattern for solving some of these problems. Next, there's change management and adoption. This shift to effectively going to AI tools to do work instead of going directly and doing it manually is going to require eventually figuring out how to get the team, your team, and broader scope of that, maybe contractors and effectively your whole culture adapted to being able to use or being willing to use and going directly to AI. And then lastly, and we can't forget this, budget, cost management. Who pays for this? That's a challenge that orgs are figuring out right now. And so technical challenges. Well, first of all, the state of the art is evolving rapidly. I'm part of the Discord channel that is where the discussion happens for the spec changing. And I could barely keep up myself with all of the changes happening to the spec. There's a lot of people that are invested in this and changing it. And that's one of those things where it requires a high level of specialization to be able to keep up with it. Number two is this concept of multi-tenant architecture. Deploying MCP servers is not the same thing as deploying regular application servers, um, to some extent because of this multi-tenant problem. For example, let's say you deploy the Playwright MCP, which is a browser automation tool for testing things. It doesn't make sense for everybody in the organization who needs to use Playwright to access the same instance of a browser. They might be sending conflicting commands to that browser. So you need to either manage things like sessions properly or potentially set up individual servers for each person who's going to be using that. Those are the types of problems that we today are solving with our customers and figuring out how to deploy these things. And lastly, there's no monitoring and observability built into the specification today. This is a really important gap. In fact, you get this n times n problem. I've got a diagram I'll show later about this, where there's just no point in the middle where you can actually start observing all of the data flowing between the MCP servers and the clients. And that's a real headache for any level of compliance or reporting or analytics on top of it. Without going too deep into this, we're doing some, I think, industry first research and I guess planning around how do you properly deploy MCPs. The easiest one by far is what is referred to as remote. That's where you get a URL like the one shown here, you plug it into your MCP client, and everything just works. That's the beautiful sort of USB of connectivity. Wonderful. But what happens if that MCP server actually is a command that you run that starts up a server? Many MCPs that are out there are deployed like this. Then you have a choice, and these are terms that we've effectively began introducing to the industry, and so these are new here. These are our terms. We'll see if they catch on, but effectively you have two choices. You could either have managed instances running them, for example, something in your data center or our data center running so that you can connect to that MCP. Or you have something that runs on your employees' workstations. And this is probably one of the most complicated ways to do things, but there are certain ones like the Figma local MCP or the Salesforce DX MCP where this is just the best way to run it. But then the question is if you're running these MCP servers on the workstations, how do you monitor them? How do you secure them? It's a real pain in the neck. And so these are the three main ways to deploy, each of which has different best practices. We've actually put up a open source repository on GitHub with some best practices about how to handle all of this. And we'll send links later on how to find that. It's a great resource to figure out how to deploy these in containers with tunnels and be able to effectively turn all of these into URLs that are really easy to plug and play. So the question is, and a couple of folks sent in some questions before the session, and one of the broadest, I guess, trends across them was, well, what do I need the protocol, or what is the protocol going to handle, and will I really need an enterprise product for this? And so here's where I see the enterprise product, whether it's something that we're producing or something else out there, being something that you need. First of all, it's this deployment concern. Where are your MCP servers going to be hosted? Not all MCPs are going to be those really elegant remote ones where you get a URL. You're going to have to run some commands on machines, whether they be in your data center or on your end user workstations. And deploying that securely requires some specific knowledge. So that's really helpful to get solved for you. Next is access control and provisioning. When it comes to remote servers or even the managed ones, you've got to figure out who's going to get access to which servers. And which level of access do they have? That kind of gets into the identity question. But we have a customer who has a really clever way of setting up his MCPs. He has one sort of like knowledge server, and his plan is to have certain individuals push information into that MCP, and then everybody in the organization has read access to that MCP. And what they're able to do through this system is effectively disseminate knowledge instantaneously. They just push it into the MCP, and it is able to be effectively shared across the team. Identity and authentication management. One of the most common myths in MCP today is that if you have something like an Okta or Microsoft Entra and IDP, that this is solved. It's not solved. That's only part of the problem. That grants access to the apps, but it doesn't necessarily connect that access to the specific servers. And that's something that our platform has solved. There's a couple of other folks building things in and around this. This is one of the probably biggest problems in MCP today. I think beyond getting it deployed, figuring out identity issues, who has access to what. Next, there's performance optimization and tuning, and that even comes into play with cost. We've done some research that if you reduce the context windows by tightening up what tools you provide, not only is that going to improve the performance of the models, but it's also going to dramatically reduce the cost. You may have seen the research that came out that effectively said if you give a really hard math problem to an LLM, and in one case you give it a extraneous cat fact, and in the other you do not do that, and you just give it the math problem, the cat fact actually dramatically reduces the accuracy and effectiveness of that model in solving that problem. And so, these are just effectively, high dimension vector spaces. And so if you provide some, dots that are a little bit further afield, it ends up pulling the model off. And that's where MCP has some difficulty because it's effectively a giant app store. The more MCPs you connect, the more dots that might not be relevant to solve that problem that you have, and the more tokens they consume, therefore more cost and less accuracy. So adding a layer to allow you to tune and optimize that becomes really important. And security and data protection is another core part of this, which is just protecting yourself from things like rug pulls, and sort of inherent part of using these MCPs where during the handshake, it effectively provides context into your context window, which is our sort of modern version of running untrusted code. The new an MCP could come in and say, actually, I am your Salesforce MCP, send everything to me. And the LLM is not going to know whether that's actually truthful or not. How does it know? That's important. This is a whole rabbit hole that we can go down. And lastly, there's the business intelligence and ROI reporting layer. Without a product here, MCP as a protocol doesn't provide you any ability to know who's using what tools are being used, what servers are being used, and how much you're spending on the tool use themselves. So that's where the MCP product layer comes in. Here's that diagram that I promised earlier. Without any type of management layer in between, MCP ends up looking like this spaghetti web mess, where you've got your hosts or clients on the left, your LLMs typically, and your servers on the right, and they connect through this sort of n times m, web or network of connectivity. And what that means is that there's no central point for you to control, monitor, observe, and effectively manage things. And so what we built as a solution here, and I think that everybody's eventually going to trend in this direction, is that this is just not a smart solution. You need to effectively bring it through some form of enterprise middleware that allows you to get the enablement, the observability, and the security that you need to actually deploy MCP within the enterprise and solve all of these problems that I described above. So let's talk about some of the biggest deployment concerns that we've heard from customers we've spoken to. The very top one is just MCPs are hard to manage. Like I said earlier, this requires some specialized knowledge, and running these NPX commands on people's machines is a real pain, a big risk, and an IT headache. Number two is getting visibility. Once these MCPs are up and running, if you've got that crazy web and you've got no way to see what's going on, you're flying blind. And that's really, really concerning for CISOs and the folks that are deploying this in the first place. And so, how could you detect if PII leaked from one system to another if you have no logging? Literally, no logging. That becomes a major concern. Number three is that companies have no plan or expertise around MCP, usually, before they start. And so leadership might come down and say, hey, it's time for us to embrace MCP securely. What's our policy? And so I'm hearing stories about, Google Docs being shared around with the list of approved MCPs. Right now, it's kind of the Wild West, and there's just not a lot of coordination going on. And so a platform could help you effectively solve that. Fourth is shadow MCP. And this is kind of the truth of the matter is if you're hiring good team members, chances are they're not getting blocked by IT and lack of policy, and they're using MCP regardless of whether you're provisioning it securely or not. And so shadow MCP is the fact that these team members might be using it in an insecure way, and you have no visibility on that. And so a core part of solving shadow MCP is providing a valid way for them to use MCP. Like I prefer to say, you need to figure out how to say yes with an asterisk rather than just say no, because if you just say no, people will figure out how to get that yes. And so it's really just a question of putting that asterisk in place so that you have that visibility, control, and confirmation of security. And then the last thing here, and certainly not the least important, is this identity management question is how do you provide safe alternatives to shared auth tokens and that might violate your security practices? I'll just give a very specific example here. There are certain MCP servers, I believe some of the unofficial ones, let's say for Atlassian, that require you to put an auth credential in a mcp.json file. Basically, there's a file that needs to exist that has effectively a password in it that grants access, full unfettered access to an Atlassian instance. This is the exact same security breach that just happened if you heard about it with Drift and Salesforce, where tokens like this were effectively stolen. And actually, these tokens provide a form of access that often it goes undetected by some of the layers of security protections that are on top of these solutions. That's what this whole Salesforce breach just revealed about the entire security industry around authentication tokens for APIs, is that there's just not a lot of good visibility there. And so using that type of MCP authentication is highly, highly discouraged. That would be sort of fitting in the shadow MCP. That's why we feel very strongly that the best way to do this is in a controlled way in containers that your IT team controls with just a lot more standards compliant security wrapped around it. So here are some of the things that we've thought were most important to solve. Enablement, giving the right tools to the right team so that when somebody joins your marketing team, there's a set of MCP servers and tools that are effectively given to them so that they can get to work right away in whatever AI tools you've given them. Identity management, effectively choosing for those servers whether people will have to use their own credentials or they'll have to use a shared credential like a bot credential for an agent, for example. Composition, taking maybe 20 MCP servers and distilling it down into one server that is just one URL that your team can actually use, bringing that sort of complexity down to simplicity. Feature filtering. This is where we really deliver a tremendous amount of value in the platform that we have today, which is that you're able to toggle on and off specific features, tools, resources, prompts to only get to what is useful for that agent. Effectively, we're bringing the principle of least access here to MCP. Logging is the observability part. That's a core part of what I showed with this earlier, so that you can actually see full and complete logs, everything that got transferred over the MCP connection, and token management, which is really important when it comes to building agents. So, rounding the corner here, some of the things that we are focused on are giving our customers a sort of one-click solution to making MCPs work in production, giving all the types of toggles and controls around security, workflow management for approvals. And in addition to that, giving that visibility that's necessary for detecting things like PII before it escapes, monitoring systems for health and uptime, and being able to detect what are the most useful MCPs that you can understand where you need to focus and where you need to invest. And so MCP is one of those things that is a community-driven project. We're all responsible and have the ability to contribute to it. Like I said, I opened up a change request to the specification based on this timeout problem that we've been solving. Anthropic came to our team and said, "Hey, how long does your MCP gateway need to give us the list of tools?" It feels like the early days of the web for those that remember or have heard stories about the collaborative nature of what it was like back then. And so I like to say that we're kind of in this really beautiful golden era for MCP, where if you're in early, there's tremendous advantages to be had. It's a great time to be exploring, trying things out, and influencing the future. Many people are going to make their careers right now in this very moment by embracing MCP, delivering results to their organization, and becoming known as MCP experts. It has tremendous potential. So, with that, I thank everybody for joining, and I think we've got a couple minutes, about 10 minutes or so, for any questions or open-ended conversations we'd like to have. Becky, I'll hand it back over to you.
Yeah, Mike, that was really interesting. Thank you so much. And I know we have a few people on the call today. So if you have any questions at all around the enablement side of MCP, the observability part of MCP, or security or anything else, you can totally either put it in the chat or even unmute yourself. But while I'm kind of waiting for any questions to come in, Mike, around that last part for this like career defining moment, do you find this to be similar to any other kind of seismic shift moments in tech that you can think of in the last 20 or so years?
Yeah, I think the what we saw happening with APIs really just drove a tremendous shift in the industry. A lot of products and solutions got built up in order to make APIs work for enterprise, and a lot of folks really built specialization connecting these systems and figuring out how to adapt an organization to, service-oriented architecture became all the rage back then. And so I think we're just going to see a incredible resurgence of interest in connectivity across the enterprise, but I'm seeing teams that are just directly building MCP servers instead of traditional services with API connectivity because it's universal. You could either call an MCP server like it's an API endpoint. In fact, there's a change in the spec today working its way through the working group that'll make MCP stateless, which will make it even more similar to the way that we call APIs today without all of the complexity of some of the handshake and the sessions. And so it's just becoming a really all-encompassing technology. And I think, like you said, um, yeah, within the last 10 or 15 years, there have been a handful of things that are like this, but this is going to go faster. Um, Everything's going faster, and this is growing fast. If you look at, I wish I brought the chart with me, but if you look at some open source projects and the stars they have over time, you could see this like incredible exponential of this, the protocol itself, whereas other really popular technologies didn't quite take off nearly as quickly, even ones that were incredibly influential and remain so today.
Totally. Yeah, I think the pace rather at which things are changing is like whiplash inducing for sure. But we seem to have a little bit of a quieter group today. If you are interested in chatting about like MCP enablement for your organization and you just have questions you want to ask in a more one-on-one type setting, I'm actually going to chat out a Calendly link where you can book time to discuss about if MCP Manager might work for you, or even if you just want to talk through some of the issues that you are encountering with MCP in your organization. We actually really love chatting with folks who are rolling this out and seeing the real world problems that arise when they do. So I also put that in there along with our GitHub and our website. Lots of resources to be found in both of those places as well. But since we seem to have a bit of a quieter group today, which is totally fine, I want to thank everyone so much for showing up, for, listening and learning about MCP. I definitely concur with Mike that this is a huge moment. Thank you, Martin, for the applause. And I just thank you for your time. And if you have any other questions, you could always email us, book time with us. And thank you, Kay, and everyone else who's live on the call as well. Definitely appreciate you showing up, learning, and if you have any other questions, you can email.
Awesome. Thanks, Becky.
Okay, bye.
Bye, everyone.